Hey everybody, we are here for the Iran So Far Away lecture. Bad 80s reference to a Flock of Seagulls song, if you're not familiar with that pop culture reference, but it's there. So we're going to talk about the 80s, well, the late 70s and then the 1980s, and then we'll very, very quickly recap the presidents that come after that. So I call this Iran So Far Away because Iran really figures very heavily into the 1980s, late 70s, and 80s into the foreign policy picture. It's kind of a new development that happens at this period of time, and it starts during Jimmy Carter's presidency. Probably you could argue it starts earlier than that, but in 1979 is when it all comes to kind of hit us in the face. So Jimmy Carter will take over the White House from Gerald Ford. He barely beats him, surprisingly. I didn't really think about that election, the 1976 election, until I was looking into this. And I would have thought that Gerald Ford would have lost by a mile because of the whole Nixon pardon thing and the worsening economy, but it was a very close election, it turns out. So Jimmy Carter comes in. He runs as a Washington outsider. I bet you've never heard that one before. Every once in a while, every few cycles, we'll have someone come in and kind of do that and kind of win and take over and maybe change things a little bit. I guess that's how our system works. He is the governor of Georgia. He is a businessman. He's a Navy guy, and actually they had a peanut farm. It's kind of strange, but he runs as a Washington outsider. He's kind of a Southerner, kind of a Southern Baptist Christian sort of good guy, and he runs that way as opposed to again all these Washington kind of politicians, right? The problem that he runs into, well, there's many problems, and while certainly there are some positive things that happen, Jimmy Carter is actually looked at as being much more positive after his presidency than during his presidency. He's kind of looked on as being maybe average at best. Weirdly, he's the oldest president, or the president who's lived the longest. He's still alive. He's the only president to live for 40 years after they took office. He's, of course, our oldest and earliest president who's still alive. All these kind of weird things about him from that standpoint. And so he's still around. He still runs around, and he's big in Habitat for Humanity and a bunch of other things, other causes like former presidents tend to do. But again, he inherits a number of challenges. Number one, perhaps, is the difficult economy. We've already mentioned this in previous lectures that Nixon and Gerald Ford had to kind of deal with this economy as things were getting worse. Inflation was starting to rise, unemployment was starting to rise, prices were starting to go higher, but wages were starting to stagnate. That's this idea of stagflation, which is a taking two words, inflation and stagnation, and jamming them together, and you have a stagnating economy. In other words, unemployment continues to grow or stay steady at a high level. Wages aren't growing, but inflation continues to grow. And that's a really bad combination, but it's a weird combination because usually the way that the government goes about trying to correct unemployment kind of lends itself to higher maybe inflation, and the way they kind of combat inflation might lend itself to higher unemployment, and so it's a very difficult kind of situation we find ourselves in. It's somewhat unusual. It's not like the Great Depression. It's very different, but there are of course the fears that it's going to go into another Great Depression, and so the government's going to start stepping in and making changes. So you have this stagflation. Inflation rates are very, very high. Like, I don't know what they are right now, but historically, they're down around 2 or 3%. They try to keep them that way. But during this period of time, they'll get as much as 12, 15%. And so that might not mean anything to you, but it would if you were trying to borrow money, because it makes money way more expensive to borrow. So if you're going in and buying a home today, you might get a 4% rate. Back in 1978, you might get a 12% or a 15% rate. And the reality is, no one's going to be able to afford to buy a house at that rate or buy an automobile at that rate. And so it makes it tough for consumers to buy things. It makes it tough for businesses to borrow money. And you already know that The banking industry is necessary to a modern economy. And when they're not making money, that creates all kinds of other problems for everyone. So again, it's very different than the Great Depression, but it's kind of heading in another bad direction here. And of course, the problem is for Jimmy Carter anyway, is that all the blame sort of lands on him because he's president of the United States. And all the different things they're doing to try to fix it don't seem to fix it. So very high inflation rates, relatively high unemployment, nothing again like during the Depression, but still very high. And there's another issue during this period of time called bracket creep, which is where taxes increase faster than your wages increase. So the net result of that is you're actually bringing home less money year after year, even though you're getting a raise. So because taxes go up faster than your raise goes up, prices are going up because of inflation. So the bottom line there is you're taking home fewer dollars, and those dollars are buying fewer things. And that's a huge problem for Americans. Layer on top of that the energy crisis, I'll just call it oil shortages here, and that creates a whole nother level of problems of misery for Americans. So you're going to have this is of course super complicated, and we could spend hours discussing this, like all these topics we cover in here very briefly. I'm sure you can read more about it in your textbook, and you have the interwebs to look into this if you want, which I highly encourage. And there are numerous books written about all these topics, which I'd highly encourage you to read. Read 10 books on a given issue or subject, and that'll give you a pretty good idea of what was going on. Not just one book, read 10. In any case, we're going to have a lot of things going on. So the 1970s are going to see this growing movement to protect the environment, which is a good thing. So the EPA rules are going to come out. So how does that affect us? We're trying to save, protect the air, protect the water, that kind of thing, which are great things. We need to do that. But sometimes, well, all the time, that comes at a cost. So for example, to do that, we're going to make so many rules that it becomes really difficult, really expensive, really, for Americans to produce oil. Not so much dig it up or pump it out. That's one thing, but also to refine it. So we kind of kick that to foreign countries, particularly the Middle East. So oil coming out of Iraq and Saudi Arabia and so on is very cheap, and it's cheaper to buy their oil than it is to produce something with ours. And so we've been doing that for a good while. So for decades, the U.S. has been the number one exporter of oil, but now that's transitioning to the Middle East, and we're becoming one of the number one consumers of oil. You add to that there's this war in Israel between Israel and basically everybody else, but particularly Egypt and Syria. They invade Israel. Israel beats them up. And of course, Israel has the support of the United States and Great Britain and others. And kind of as a result of all of this, Israel beats them up pretty heavily. As a result of all this, you're going to have a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, which are increasingly becoming anti-West, or that's religion. They are going to get together, essentially, and create something called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they're going to then kind of almost hold the West hostage by raising prices on oil, because remember, we've been buying all this oil from them, and that's going to make oil prices jump through the roof. There's a whole panic. I mean, it's kind of like the toilet paper panic of 2020. Everyone's going to go out and buy it. It'll be hard to find. And the net result of all of that is this huge oil shortage and energy crisis. So think about it. When oil gets ridiculously expensive, that makes everything else cost more. So if the barrel of oil price doubles and triples, which it will during this period of time, that means gas prices are going to go way up. So imagine a gas hike of 400%. So even as low as gas prices are for us here in May of 2020, where they're about $1.50 a gallon, even less in some places. Imagine it being, what would that would be $6 a gallon. 6 months ago would have made gas $8 or $9 a gallon. 5 or 6 years ago, remember, gas was $3 or $4 a gallon here, and it was worse elsewhere. So imagine paying $8 or $10 per gallon for gas. That's really going to impact your lifestyle, right? You're not going to drive as much. You're not going to be able to drive as much. You just can't afford it. It's a huge budgetary problem. Of course, it also impacts everything else because everything moves on fuel. So your grocery prices are going to go up, heating prices, electricity prices are going to go up. Everything's going to go up because of this oil shortage. Layer on top of that a shortage. That means you can't get as much as you want or as you need. In fact, I'm going to show you a picture in a minute. There will be huge lines. I remember when I was old enough to remember this. I'm dating myself. Maybe some of you too can remember this, but I'm old enough to remember the late 1970s when we had to wait in line for an hour to buy gas, or 2 hours sometimes. You could only buy gas on certain days. And then the problem was you could only buy so much gas. And this is the 1970s, the era where everyone was driving big cars. We had a Buick Riviera, 1976. It was gigantic and had a 455 cubic inch engine. I don't know how bad the gas mileage was. That was my mom's car. And, buying 10 gallons to put in that car doesn't go very far. Maybe 100, I don't know, 100 miles. And that's just not conducive to doing business or living life. So that's going to create a huge problem. We already have the EPA and challenges with how we're building cars. You add on an oil shortage. This is why the Japanese and German auto industry gets a real jump in America, because they're building cars that are way more fuel efficient. So Honda, Toyota, Datsun, which becomes Nissan, Volkswagen, of course, and others who make inexpensive cars but get really good gas mileage. They're going to start selling cars in America. So we bought a Honda in 1978, a station wagon, because we couldn't sit in the little pickup truck anymore. And so that was Dad's car that he drove to work all the time. The big car, the Buick, sat in the garage unless it had to be used during this period of time, because again, it was really hard to get gas and gas was expensive. So this is going to create huge problems, and that's super unpopular, and Carter takes the brunt of that, and Carter's going to take the blame for most of that. So that's kind of what's going on the economic side. It's really bad, or it's looking and getting worse and worse and worse. Now on the foreign policy side, there's a whole bunch of other things going on. The Soviet Union's going to invade Afghanistan in 1979. Some of you may have been to Afghanistan and had the pleasure of serving in Afghanistan. Well, this is something that's been going on for decades. And we were involved in Afghanistan too, not with troops, but with the CIA, with countering the Soviet involvement. So basically kind of a communist government took over in Afghanistan, and then things fell apart. The Russians invaded to try to hold everything together. Of course, the United States, the British, and our other allies got angry and upset at that. And we then helped the rebels fight against this Russian invasion. This is a war that lasts almost the entire decade. Some people call this the Soviet Vietnam, because they lost and they ended up leaving, kind of like we did in Vietnam. But it's another proxy war. This time Soviet troops are there and the Americans are helping behind the scenes. Where Vietnam, remember, American troops are there and the Soviets are helping the Vietnamese or the North Vietnamese behind the scenes. So it's just one more example of a proxy war. And again, it lasts for about 8 or 9 years until the Russians finally sort of bailed out, just like we bailed out of Vietnam. Really difficult time. Understand what happened is we went in there and we were giving money and training and weapons and support to the people fighting the Russians. Well, fast forward to the last decade and a half or 2 decades, not a surprise that the people we're now fighting in Afghanistan are some of the people we trained or helped train, or those groups train. We find our weapons there now turned on us. It's a pretty difficult situation. But that's what we were doing. Remember, we were trying to fight communism. One result of that, kind of a weird thing, we boycotted the 1980 Olympics, which was super unpopular. That doesn't help Jimmy Carter when he boycotts the 1980 Olympics, which is during an election year. It's super unpopular. But he said, hey, we're not going to Russia. That's where the Olympics were. We're not going to do that. We're protesting this whole thing. The Russians will boycott the 1984 Olympics, which happened in Los Angeles. So we have that going on in the background of all this. Again, the second half of Jimmy Carter's presidency. Even worse than that is the Iran hostage crisis, which began in November of 1979 and lasted until January of 1981. So basically, the entire election cycle for that 1980 election, we have this problem where 52 Americans are going to be held hostage. And we all know about it. I remember seeing this on the news on a regular basis. It was creepy as a young boy watching blindfolded hostages being paraded around or talking and different things. It's exactly like what you would see in the movies. And so lots going on with that. Basically, Iran was a pro-American country. The pro-American Shah of Iran was deposed by a religious zealot named whose title is the Ayatollah. His name is Khomeini, and they hated America. And eventually, again, they capture this embassy, and they take all these people hostage, and it's basically blackmail. Carter won't really deal with them. There's a rescue attempt that fails, and a bunch of Marines get killed. It makes Carter look weak. It makes the United States look weak. It makes the Marines look bad. A whole bunch of stuff like that going on. Meanwhile, Iran's demanding that we turn over the money and we turn over the Shah of Iran, who had gone to America. All this kind of crazy stuff. And really keep in mind, this is unfolding on television. This is on the news every day. And Ronald Reagan, who's running against him in 1980, doesn't even really have to say anything about it because it's just making Carter look really, really bad. But they will eventually be released. And in fact, they're released really just a few minutes after Reagan takes office. It has nothing to do with Reagan. Some deals were made finally, but it doesn't matter. It was too late. So Jimmy Carter, again, is universally viewed as kind of an average president at best. Some say he's very weak. But he's another idealist. If you want to put him in a category, he's right there with Woodrow Wilson. If we would all just get along, wouldn't things work out better? And of course, that's true, except we're not all just going to get along. So that creates some foreign policy headaches, I think. So here's a few pictures from the 70s. The big picture on the left is the lines at the gas pumps in the United States. I don't know if you can even imagine such a thing. Yes, gas was 72 cents, but it had been maybe 20 cents before that. And all of a sudden it's really, really high. And then you can't buy enough. So you can see a lot of these cars are really big cars. There's one little Honda up there. This is probably late 70s. Look at all those station wagons and big sedans. There's a Mustang at the bottom of this. There's it looks like a Camaro, a couple of rows up. There's all these huge cars. These cars suck up a ton of gas. Imagine waiting in line forever. Keep in mind, there weren't nearly as many gas stations then, 40, 50 years ago, as there are now. We have gas stations everywhere. And so it was a real nightmare, I remember, trying to get gas. These other pictures, the one on the left side, the right side on the top, is some Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan that we are supporting. So we're supporting all these rebels against the Russians, against the Soviets. The picture on the bottom right is Iran kind of burning, looks like an American. It says CIA, and you can kind of see an American flag in there. They're burning us in effigy. They, by and large, hated us, even though Iran had been a pretty pro-West, pro-American country for several decades. In fact, if you look at pictures of Iran in the 1950s and early 60s, it's very different than what it looked like in the 80s and 90s. It just did a complete shift, and a lot of that had to do with religious movements and who had power in the area. In fact, that's when America became the Great Satan, or at least we were termed the Great Satan. It was by Iran. So Iran becomes this real enemy. And they're this one exception to that rule we saw earlier about being a communist or a not communist. Iran's in its own separate category after this. They're not communist. They're also not an ally. They're an enemy. And so it's kind of the beginning of this world we all live in now, where there's global terrorism and these kind of things, and there's sort of religious movements that are creating trouble in certain parts of the world. This is where this stuff begins, probably, is in the 70s. I mean, it goes back further than that, but where it really starts to manifest itself as communism and the Cold War is coming to an end, this new kind of global terror issue arises. So, all of that is Jimmy Carter's 4 years in office. It's no wonder that he gets hammered by the next president, Ronald Reagan, and he defeats him in a huge landslide. But in 1984, Reagan won every state except one and part of the District of Columbia. And he's got the most total electoral college votes a president's ever won, the second most percentage wise behind Franklin Roosevelt. Of course, there were fewer electoral college delegates, right, in the 1930s and 40s than there were in 1984. But anyway, humongous landslide. And a lot of it's because of the whole issue in the 1970s, 79, 80. You got the economy, you got Afghanistan, and kind of felt like poorly handled. And you got the Iran crisis, which made him look weak, made us look weak. And then Reagan comes along, and he's this great communicator. He was an actor before he was a politician, very popular governor of California in the 60s. And he's like Franklin Roosevelt was on the radio. That's how Reagan is on the television. He's smooth, he's funny. People just kind of gravitated toward him. So he's going to win this election by a mile, win the next election by 2 miles, and he's considered one of the greater presidents that we've ever had, right up there with Roosevelt and a few others. There was even talk, and this was ridiculous, but of carving his face onto Mount Rushmore, which of course is absurd. But in any case, some of the things going on here in the 80s, the what's called Reaganomics, which is the sort of economic policy that he is going to profess, and it has to do with reducing taxes. That gives you more money to spend, which helps generate actually more taxes. That's the thinking here. To deregulate a lot of businesses so that, again, one of the problems is regulations cost money for businesses. Therefore, they cost money to the consumer. If you deregulate some of those things, of course, that's where politics is, right? How much should we deregulate? Should we even deregulate? Those are those kind of arguments. Again, I'll let you do that, hash those out in your government class. But their thinking is we deregulate things, and that opens business up. And the better business does, the better the typical American does. And we're going to see in the 80s a very dramatic rise in incomes, and just the general wealth of the nation through the 80s is going to be very, very high. He's also going to cut spending in some places, but of course we're going to raise spending in others. The military gets a huge boost in spending. Military personnel get a raise for the first time in a long time. Of course, we're fighting the communists. So he's a huge proponent of the Cold War, keeping that going, keeping the pressure on the Soviet Union, because the feeling was they can't possibly last too much longer. And if we just keep the pressure on, they're going to implode. And actually, that is what happens toward the end of his presidency and the beginning of George H.W. Bush's presidency. Things start to unravel, and the Soviet Union will disappear, and the Cold War essentially is over in the early 90s. So you've got this sort of economic policy. He asked for a huge tax break. Remember, we talked about bracket creep, taxes going up faster than wages. You cut taxes back, so now wages can go up faster, gives people more money to spend. That generates more business, more demand, which generates, again, the idea is it generates everything. And in the end, the government actually makes more money. That's the thinking. So a lot of things going on. The Iran-Iraq war actually started, I think, in 1979, 1980, but it really kind of takes off during the 80s. Again, I remember watching this on television. So you have Iran and Iraq at war. So who do you think the U.S. is going to support? Because Iran's an enemy, so we're going to support Iraq and Saddam Hussein. You know him. Again, I'm sure some of you have been to Iraq and had that pleasure, but kind of, strange how things turned around. So we're going to support Iraq against Iran in that war. It's ugly and brutal. And who knew that 30 years later we would go into Iraq and have a war there ourselves, fighting the same people, some of the same weapons that we put there in the first place. And so through the 80s, that'll be, again, kind of in the background on television. We'll be monitoring that. And something that comes out of that is the so-called Iran-Contra affair. And you got to kind of see what's going on in the background here. The U.S., remember, supports anti-communist groups all over the world. Remember, you're either a communist or you're not a communist. And so if you're not a communist and you're fighting against communists, whether they're in the government or they're rebels, the US is going to back them. So we're talking about Contra being South American, like Nicaragua, several other places. This is not limited to that, but those are the big ones. And we'll be supporting these regimes or rebels in these places, and it becomes unpopular. We've been doing it for years, for decades, but it becomes unpopular. Congress says, "Hey, we don't want to do that anymore." And then later on, it comes to find out there's money still being funneled to some of these groups, and it's a whole huge scandal and investigation again called the Iran Contra affair, the Iran Contra scandal. And basically, the idea was that the CIA began selling weapons to Iran and doing some different things. And it was supposed to be over hostages and different things going on, but they started funneling a bunch of the money they were making. Let's keep in mind what's going on, right? There's Iran-Iraq war. We're supporting Iraq, but then the CIA selling some stuff to Iran. Also, Iran's a big enemy anyway, and we're selling stuff to Iran. And that's got to be a big no-no. Then it comes to find out that some of the money from those sales are being funneled into South American freedom fighters or, again, anti-communist groups. Congress had already said, we're not doing that anymore. And so when this comes out, everyone wants to know, did Reagan order this? Because if he did, he directly violated Congress and he's in trouble. Very much like Nixon, or any one of these other presidential scandals. If he knew about it, if he ordered it, that'll wipe him out. He is in a second term, though, and there will be a huge investigation. It'll be on television. Basically, Reagan will come out later and say, this is my fault because I'm the president, but really he says I didn't order it. I didn't really know what was going on. He gets criticism for not knowing what's going on. A guy named Oliver North, a colonel, an operative, kind of takes the blame for it. Several people get indicted. I think most of them get pardoned or it gets, done away with. And Reagan never really does suffer the same kind of fate that Nixon does. Reagan's super popular. He never gets blamed for it. Again, there's criticism, but it certainly doesn't do in his political career. So also during the 80s, you have the space shuttle. Some of you may remember the space shuttle program. It was a big deal. We used to watch the space shuttle launch in school. Unfortunately, we watched the first one explode, and I don't know what year that was. I was in 6th grade when that happened. So how old are people in 6th grade? 12, 13? I don't know. So mid 80s. And, space shuttle is a big deal. But we also get the end of the Cold War here. And so Reagan's a sort of big proponent on hammering on the Soviets, hammering on the communists, much like Kennedy was, much like Eisenhower was. Nixon, remember, was all about détente and kind of bringing us together. Reagan wasn't so much about that. He was about bringing them to their knees, and he called them the axis of evil or the evil empire. And he has this famous speech right at the end of his presidency where he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down these walls. And of course, you got this succession of Russian leaders, Soviet leaders. The Soviet Union is having all kinds of turmoil economically and internally and all this, and they're just unraveling. And so Gorbachev, you may remember Gorbachev, he has got the big birthmark on his forehead. Saturday Night Live used to love, making fun of that guy, and pretty funny skits going on in the 80s. But in the end, the Soviet Union does kind of fall apart, and the Berlin Wall does kind of come down. We'll talk more about the Berlin Wall in a minute. So some pictures from the 80s. The top right, that's Colonel Oliver North as he's testifying. Again, this is on television in these hearings about the Iran-Contra affair. And the argument is, hey, Reagan never did tell us to do this stuff, but we kind of thought we read between the lines and we did some of this stuff anyway. And so some of these other guys kind of take the blame. No evidence to suggest that Reagan actually did know. The little kind of graph, it's hard to read, I know, that's up in the top left corner is called the misery index. You add unemployment and inflation, and you can see that big spike right in the middle. That's during Jimmy Carter's presidency and Nixon's presidency, those two big spikes. And then it comes way down. Reagan is the big orange strip in the middle. Comes way down. So huge change. You can see, 40 years later, President Obama, on the end in the blue, it's not changed that much, right? It goes up and down, kind of like the stock market, but things are way better every decade after the 70s in terms of the misery index. So you can see unemployment fluctuates, inflation's come way down relative to unemployment. So the misery index shrinks. So things have gotten better. But you can see that drastic change during the 80s. And so that's one of the reasons why Reagan's so very, very popular, is because these massive changes did happen. Of course, you see an image of one of the space shuttles here is a big deal. We don't do that program anymore. Too many people have been killed. We've had 2 space shuttles explode. One, it was in 1985, 1986. I think that was the year 86. One back in 2000, 2001. And we haven't really done that since. The bottom picture on the left is just a picture of Saddam Hussein and the Ayatollah Khomeini in this Iran-Iraq war. And then I couldn't leave the 80s without dropping a picture of Michael Jackson Thriller in here. I mean, he is the 80s. He was the king of pop. I think he still is. Thriller is still one of the, maybe the best-selling album in the universe. And this was a whole different time in the 80s. And again, you can't think of the 80s without Michael Jackson. I do want to talk about the Berlin Wall for just a couple minutes, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So you can see here a picture of Berlin. So Berlin, remember, sort of echoes Germany. Germany is split in half between the Soviet half and the Western or US, British, French half. And Berlin, which is in the Soviet half, also gets split in half. And you can see this red ribbon that runs down the middle of the city. That's the Berlin Wall. And remember, the wall wasn't built to keep the West out. It was built to keep the East in. They don't want Easterners running to the West, escaping to the West, which is what people do. Nobody wants to escape the West and go into the East. It's horrible. The conditions in the East are very poor. They're very, they're typical Soviet era, communist era poverty. Meanwhile, West Berlin, like West Germany, is thriving and doing very, very well. So we, of course, have a lot of troops in that region, and there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the 80s. But you can see that. And that wall has become symbolic for communism everywhere in the world. So the Berlin Wall, which is only in Berlin, becomes the symbol of communist sway over all of Eastern Europe and parts of Asia and other places in the world. And so the Berlin Wall coming down, when you see a picture of it opening up here, I mean, it literally is a wall. There's a moat, there are barbed wire and machine gun emplacements and all this kind of stuff. They literally just start tearing down the wall in 1989. And this is a 20th anniversary picture that you see here in 2009. But the wall just literally starts coming down. And then now Germany has to integrate East and West because the Soviet Union has imploded. And all of those countries that they've been controlling are now sort of on their own. And they got to figure out what to do. I suppose East Germany has the better path forward than these other countries because they can merge. Still an ongoing issue. I've heard people say that being in Berlin in the 80s, before the wall comes down, if you're in West Berlin, it's like being in modern era America, basically, with that weird German twist, right? But if you looked across the wall into East Berlin, it was like you're still in the 1940s. It was almost like color on one side, black and white on the other side. That's how different things were. And so this coming down is the symbol of the end of communism. The Soviet Union will dissolve in the next few years. Again, they're not the same thing as Russia now. We have the Russian Federation, similar, but it's different, different situation. And the whole communism issue is largely dead as a world issue. All right, it's still happening on small scale, still failing everywhere it goes on a small scale, but Reagan will get credit then for the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, though it takes a few years to kind of play itself out. And the big idea here is that think about Kennedy and Nixon and Eisenhower and some of those guys during that period of time. We stood tall against the communists. We didn't back down. We didn't win every time, but a lot of the time we were able to contain them and hold them in. And we did what we had to do. And we just sort of outspent them and outweighted them until they fell apart. And that's really what happened. So Reagan's kind of strategy is been vindicated at this point. So last bit, I'm not going to go into and discuss all the modern stuff. You'll read about that in your book. Remember, you got to do the key terms and voices of freedom assignments from all these chapters. And do keep in mind the last section, has more chapters in it than the first section. But this is just some pictures, not in any particular order, of your modern presidents. So George H.W. Bush was Reagan's vice president. May be interesting to you. He's the first vice president to become president since Martin Van Buren did it in 1836. So it had been about 150 years. Of course, Nixon did it, but remember, there was a long 8-year layoff between his vice presidency and his presidency. So it just doesn't happen very, very often. It's only happened 4 times. You're more likely to become president because of the Indian curse getting the president, remember. So there's George H.W. Bush. He's the bottom left gentleman. And then, of course, along comes Bill Clinton in 1993. He's on the top left. He'll serve 2 terms. He's a very, very popular president by almost every account. He'll be followed by George W. Bush in the top center, which, of course, is George H.W. Bush's son. So we've had our second father-son duo. We had John Quincy Adams. We've had a grandfather-grandson duo in William Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. We've had cousins in the Teddy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, and now another father-son duo. You've got Barack Obama here in 2009 taking over from George W. Bush and him serving 2 terms. And then, of course, our current president, Donald Trump. And we have an election coming up later this year, so we'll see how that goes. But a lot of things going on, right? 9/11 in 2001 happened. We had the Gulf War in the early 90s. Of course, 9/11 then leads to this whole 20-year war we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on. We've had ups and downs economically. We've had, again, global terrorism, the rise of global terrorism in the world, all sorts of things like that. This lessening of the tension between the Russians and the Americans, but growing concerns with China. I mean, we're just dealing with the pandemic that may have originated in China, maybe deliberately. Again, there's still a lot of work to be done on exactly what's going on there. So we're in this very new era. The cyber era, the internet, all those things are going to come online during this latter period of time and get us to the point where we are today. So again, you'll kind of get a taste of that when you look at those last couple chapters in the book. So that's it. So this is the last lecture in this section. So you will have an exam. It starts soon. You got to look on your schedule. I'm not going to give you any dates in here because I'll probably reuse these lectures, but you got an exam coming up. So don't be the guy who totally forgets everything like Kramer here. Watch these lectures, watch the documentaries and answer the questions that go with the documentaries. Do your key terms, do your voices of freedom. Those are the things that are going to be on the exam. All right. So skim through your books. Again, watch all my videos, watch the documentaries, do your assignments, turn everything in on time. And all that's coming to a head here pretty soon. The end of the semester is coming right around the corner. So check your schedule, course schedule, to find the specific dates. I'm sure I'll put an announcement out here soon reminding everybody of everything. But good luck on the exam, and make sure you turn all your stuff in. That's how you pass classes in college, if you don't know that by now. So good luck. And we'll see you next time. Hopefully you'll join me for another class like Western Civilization, or maybe you've got to come back for 1301. That's great. And hopefully we'll see you in the summer.